What would your life be like if you were born in North Korea? It's kind of hard for those of us on the outside to imagine. The country's official media present a bizarre picture of impossibly loyal, leader-adoring ranks of civilians and military alike. To some extent, Western media replay those images without enough skepticism for the stagey propaganda. For viewers outside the control of that secretive state, however, the glimpses convey the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of happy, socialist cadres, the people depicted come across as an indifferentiated, freakish mass. And rather than focusing on human interest features, Western news stories now tend to show a rocket blasting, perhaps followed by a map graphic showing the missile's potential radius. None of that has much to do with daily life in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as the isolated country is officially known. Even though the military and the Workers' Party of Korea remain central institutions, the focus of daily life for most North Koreans has nothing to do with politics or war. The government was once literally revered in the figures of Kim Jong-il, and especially the nation's founding father, Kim Il-sung. Now the state is something of an economic means to an end at best, and more often an unavoidable annoyance, not to mention a continuing object of fear. For a generation now, most North Koreans have lived experiences that demonstrate the patent lies of the state media. They just have to be careful who they admit it to. There was a time when everyone in North Korea made their living working for the government, and many were happy to do it. In the 1950s, the DPRK's economy was actually stronger than that of their rival, US-allied South Korea. During the days of Japanese colonization, the northern part of the peninsula was modernized for heavy industry. The South, with more favorable agricultural conditions, started off their independent era with less industrial infrastructure. In the 1960s and 70s, North Korea continued along in economic security as their neighbors in China struggled to emerge from years of deadly famine. By the 1980s, the equipment, factories, railways, and power grid that North Korea depended on was aging, as was the case in many communist countries of the era. Pretty much everyone was poor, but few were genuinely destitute. And then the bottom fell out. The prevailing philosophy during the long reign of Kim Il-sung was juche, or self-reliance. It was a matter of pride that North Koreans were in control of their own economic destiny, growing and manufacturing most of what they needed domestically. Without a doubt, the people of North Korea were incredibly industrious, but what the country's leader didn't mention was the incredible amount of support that poured in the country from China and the Soviet Union. Trading goods at a loss amounted to an indirect subsidy from neighboring giants. Most crucially, North Korea's fuel supply depended upon assistance from the USSR, and when quite suddenly there was no USSR anymore, North Korea was in trouble. The loss of foreign trade and the fuel shortage in the early 1990s started a literal death spiral for the people of North Korea. Factory production slowed. Without sufficient fertilizers or machinery, farm production slumped. There was now simply less food to go around. In those days, wages were supplemented with direct food distribution by the state. That stopped. Raw materials stopped reaching factories, and workers, left with nothing to do, were now also receiving virtually no compensation. Production of everything basically halted, and people began to starve. Many of the experiences of ordinary North Koreans in this time of destitution and during the era of radical economic change that followed are taken from North Korea Confidential by Daniel Tudor and James Pearson, who show ways that the closed society has found some openings and Barbara-demics nothing to envy, which chronicles the lives of people in North Korea's far northeastern industrial region. Demic's stories, in turn, come in large part from defectors who lived through the misery. What little residual momentum was left in North Korea's state-run economy effectively died when poor growing conditions in the mid-1990s caused massive crop failures. Now even the last vestiges of public food distribution ended. Hospitals filled with the sick and starving, and then they emptied. Those who were growing their own small gardens, the only form of private production allowed, had a little bit of a buffer, but that was no help to city dwellers. Stories of people eating tree bark and grass in those days are no exaggeration. Those who could do so hunted wild animals until they became a rarity. People scraped food out of bilge and animal dung. Exaggerated rumors raised the specter of cannibalism among the country's already suffering public. Foreign aid came in, but the regime refused to allow aid groups to distribute it themselves. Incompetence may have played some role in the poor allocation, but part of the problem was certainly a callous undervaluation of the lives of some citizens. The policy under Kim Jong-il was Song-un, or military first. Those who were considered important to the state and its defense might live, others were on their own. A low estimate for the number of deaths in the North Korean famine of the 1990s is 240,000, but it may have been as high as 600,000. The higher figure would represent a staggering 10% of the population. In a reference to a well-known story of Kim Il-sung's alleged victory over the Japanese in World War II, the era of economic depression in the 1990s became known as the Arduous March. It was in those days of misery among the ruins of the command economy that an unusual form of capitalism sprouted up. As a corollary to the acceptance of kitchen gardens, beginning in the 1980s, the regime reluctantly granted people the right to trade produce at outdoor neighborhood markets known as Jongmadang. At the height of the famine, for many, an informal Jongmadang in one's village or neighborhood might be the only place to obtain food. People developed a system of bartering. It was illegal to sell newly manufactured products in an informal market, but people would bring in second-hand goods, and people with different skill sets would offer increasing range of services like bicycle repair and hairstyling. Somehow, bags of rice from aid shipments found their way into the market stalls, and people were glad to buy this most valued commodity when they could, despite the specific ban on selling rice. In fact, as the Jong-maiden expansion was going into the late 1990s, aside from the original garden vegetables, the whole thing was illegal. But there was nothing the government could do about it, since there was no alternative that could put food on people's tables. Beginning sometime around 2002, the DPRK leadership made legal recognition of the market's official policy. Vendors could receive approval to operate in exchange for a fee for large sellers.